Good morning, students. Welcome to my class. I, Usha Sharma, will explain the chapter 4 of Themes in Indian History, Part 1, Thinkers, Beliefs and Buildings. In this chapter, we will discuss the major religious developments in early India, focusing on Buddhism. It also examines how these religious ideas were compiled as text and reflected in architecture and sculpture. Sources of this chapter: Buddhist, Jaina and Brahmanical text. Second, material remains including monuments and inscription. First, we learn about the role of the Begum of Bhopal in the preservation of the stupa at Sanchi. In the 19th century, Europeans such as French and English were interested to take away the eastern gateway of the stupa to Paris and London Museum. Shahjahan Begum of Bhopal took a wise decision to make plaster cast copies to please Europeans. This resulted in the original remains at the stake. The rulers of Bhopal, Shahjahan Begum and her successor Sultan Jahan Begum, provided money for building a museum and guest house where John Marshall lived and wrote the volumes. She also funded the publication of the volumes. Mid-first millennium BCE is regarded as a turning point in world history. It was during this period that thinkers such as Zoroaster in Iran, Kongzi in China, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle in Greece, Mahavira and Gautam Buddha in India emerged. They tried to understand the mysteries of existence and relationship between the human and cosmic order. In India, this was also the time when cities and kingdoms were developing and social and economic life was changing in a variety of ways in Ganga Valley. These thinkers of India attempted to understand these developments as well. The sacrificial tradition. The Rig Veda was compiled between century 1500 and 1000 BCE and consists of hymns in praise of a variety of deities, especially Agni, Indra and Soma. These hymns were chanted when the sacrifices were performed and people prayed for cattle, son, good health, long life and other things. The sacrifices earlier were performed collectively. Later, some were performed by the heads of household for well-being of the domestic unit. More elaborate sacrifices such as the Rasuya and Ashwamedha were performed by chiefs and kings who depended on Brahmanas priests to conduct the rituals. New questions in the early period. Many people were curious about the meaning of life, the possibilities of life after death and rebirth. These issues were hotly debated. People outside the Vedic tradition asked whatever there was even a single ultimate reality. People also began speculating on the significance of the sacrificial tradition. There were as many as 64 sects or schools of thoughts. Lively discussion and debates were took place between the teachers and these schools of thoughts. Kutagar Shala were the place where the debates of teachers who tried to convince one another and lay person about the validity of their philosophy took place. Kutagar Shala literally means hut with a pointed roof or in groves where traveling mendicants halted. Mahavira and Buddha questions the authority of the Vedas. The emphasis on individual agency, they suggested man and women could strive to attain liberation from trials and tribulations of worldly existence. This differed from the Brahmanical position, as they believed that individual existence was determined by his or her birth in specific caste or gender. The message of Mahavira or teachings of Jainism. Mahavira was preceded by 23 Tirthankara. The Tirthankaras are teachers who guide men and women across the river of existence. The teachings of Mahavira: the entire world is animated, even stones, rocks and water have life. No injury to living beings, especially to humans, animals, plants, and insects. The cycle of birth and rebirth is shaped through karma. Asceticism and penance are required to free oneself from the cycle of karma. This can be attained only by renouncing the world. Therefore, monastic existence is a necessary condition of salvation. Jain monks and nuns must take 5 vows: to abstain from killing, stealing, and lying, to observe celibacy, to abstain from possessing property. The spread of Jainism. The teachings of Mahavira were recorded by his disciples. These were in the form of stories which could appeal to ordinary people. Jaina scholars produced a wealth of literature in a variety of languages such as Prakrit, Sanskrit, and Tamil, and preserved in libraries attached to temples. Gradually, Jainism spread to many parts of India. Many stone sculptures connected with the Jaina tradition have been recovered from several sites. The Buddha and the quest for enlightenment. Buddha was one of the most influential teachers of his time. His message spread across the subcontinent and beyond through Central Asia to China, Korea, and Japan, and through Sri Lanka across the sea to Myanmar, Thailand, and Indonesia. Buddha was named Siddhartha at birth and was the son of the chief of Shakya clan. He led a sheltered upbringing in the palace, detached from the harsh realities of life. He undertook a journey into a city which was a turning point in his life. He was deeply anguished when he saw an old man, a sick man, and a corpse. It was at the moment that he realized that decay of human body was inevitable. Siddhartha left the palace in search of truth. He explored many paths, including bodily mortification. He abandoned the extreme path and meditated for several days and finally attained enlightenment and came to be known as Buddha or the Enlightened One. For the rest of his life, he taught Dhamma or the path of righteous living. Teachings of Buddhism. The world is transient and constantly changing. It is also soulless as there is nothing permanent on it. Within this transient world, sorrow is intrinsic to human existence. It is by following the middle path between self-penance and self-indulgence that human beings can rise above these worldly troubles. In the early forms of Buddhism, whether or not God existed was irrelevant. Buddha regarded the social world as a creation of humans rather than divine origin and thus advised kings and Grahapatis to be humane and ethical. Buddhism emphasized literally and extinguishing of the ego and desires and thus ends and suffering of those who renounce the world. Followers of the Buddha. The Buddhist Sangha. Buddha's last word to his followers were, "Be lamp unto yourself as all of you must work out your own liberation." The body of disciples of the Buddha or an organization of monks is called Sangha. Buddha founded a Sangha. It was an organization of monks who became teachers of Dhamma. These monks lead a simple life, possessing only the essential requisites for survival, such as a bowl to receive food once a day from the lady. As they lived on alms, they were known as bhikshu. Initially, only men were allowed into the Sangha, but later women also came to be admitted. The Buddha's foster mother, Mahaprajapati Gautami, was the first woman to be included as bhikshuni. Many women who entered the Sangha became teachers of Dhamma and went on to become theris or respected women who had attained liberation. The Buddha's followers came from many special groups. They included kings, wealthy men, and grahapati, and also humble folks, workers, slaves, and craft peoples. Once within the Sangha, all were regarded as equal, having shed their earlier social identities or becoming bhikshu and bhikshunis. The Buddhist Sangha, which comprised of bhikshu and bhikshunis, functions on the lines of ganas and sanghas, where consensus was arrived at based on discussion. If discussion failed to bring about harmony, then decisions were taken by a vote on that subject. Spread of Buddhism. Buddhism grew rapidly both during the lifetime of the Buddha and after his death. People were dissatisfied with the prevailing religions and were confused by the social changes that were occurring. Buddhism emphasized on the importance of conduct and values rather than claims of superiority based on birth. The emphasis was laid on metta and karuna, especially for those who were young and weaker than oneself. These were ideas that drew men and women to Buddhism. Chaityas. Certain places were regarded as sacred by the people in the early times. Sites which special trees or unique rocks or sites of an inspiring natural beauty with small shrine attached to them were known as chaityas. Buddhist literature describe places connected with the life of Buddha. These places are Lumbini, where he was born, Bodh Gaya, where he attained enlightenment, Sarnath, where he gave his first sermon, Kushinagra, where he attained Nibbana. Stupa. Mounds were relics of the Buddha, such as his bodily remains or objects used by him were known as stupa. It is known that Ashoka distributed portion of the Buddha's relic to every important town and ordered the construction of stupa over them. The stupa at Bharhut, Sachi and Sarnath were built by the 2nd century BCE. Inscriptions found on the railings and pillars of the stupa give ideas about the donation given by the king, guilds, bhikshu, bhikshunis and ordinary men and women for building and decorating these monuments. The early stupas were built at Sachi and Bharhut. They were plain except for the stone railing which resembled a bamboo or wooden fence and the gateways, which were richly carved and installed at the 4 cardinal points. The mound of the stupa at Amravati and Shahaji Dheri in Peshawar came to be elaborately carved with niches and sculptures compared to the early stupa at Sachi and Bharhut. Structure of stupa. Stupa is a Sanskrit word meaning a heap. The structure of stupa originated as a simple circular mound of earth called and. Gradually, it developed into a more complex structure. Above the and was the harmika, a balcony-like structure that represented the abode of the gods. Arising from the harmika was the mast called the yashti, surrounded by a chhatri or an umbrella. Around the mound was a railing separating the sacred space from the secular world. The fate of Amravati. The Mahachaitya at Amravati is now just an insignificant little mound, totally denuded of its former glory. The following factors were responsible for the present fate of Amravati. In 1796, a local Raja stumbled upon the ruins of the stupas at Amravati using its stone to build a temple. In 1854, Walter Elliot, the Commissioner of Guntur, visited Amravati and collected several sculpture panels and took them away to Madras. Colonial Colin Mackenzie also visited the site, but his report were not published. By the 1850s, some of the slabs from Amravati had begun to be taken to different places, to the Asiatic Society of Bengal at Calcutta, to the India office in Madras, and some even to London. Many of these sculptures were seen adorning the gardens of British administration. View of H. Cole on preservation of ancient monument. He wrote, "It seems to me a suicidal and indefensible policy to allow the country to be looted of original work of ancient art. He believed that museums should have plaster cast facsimiles of sculpture, whereas the original should remain where they had been found." Unfortunately, Cole did not succeed in convincing the authorities about Amravati, although his play for institution preservation was adopted in the case of Sanchi. Sculptures at Sanchi. Stories in stone. The sculptures at Sanchi are scrolls of stories which depict scenes from Jatakas. There were stories of Visantara Jataka where the prince gives up everything to the Brahmana and goes to live in forest with his wife and children. The early sculpture does not have the image of Buddha. Instead, it uses symbol like an empty seat represent meditation of the Buddha and stupa represented the Mahaparinibbana. There was the use of wheel which stood for the first sermon delivered by Buddha at Sarnath. As it is obvious, such sculpture cannot be understood literally. For example, the image of a tree does not stand simply for a tree, but symbolize an event in the life of the Buddha. Hence, historians have to familiarize themselves with the traditions of those who produce these works of art to understand such symbols. Many people who turned to Buddhism enriched it with their own pre-Buddhist and even non-Buddhist belief practices and ideas. Some other sculptures at Sanchi were not directly inspired by Buddhist idea. These include beautiful women known as Shalbhanjika swinging from the edge of the gateway holding onto a tree. According to popular belief, the mere touching of the tree by her would make the tree to flower and bear fruit. Many animals were also carved to create lively scenes to attract viewers. For example, elephant was carved which signified strength and wisdom. Another figure found at Sanchi Stupa is that of Maya, the mother of Buddha or popular goddess Gajalakshmi. The motif of a serpent was found at Sanchi. James Ferguson, a modern art historian, considered Sanchi as the center of tree and serpent worship. The development of Mahayana Buddhism. After the death of Mahatma Buddha, Buddhism divided in two parts, Hinayan and Mahayana. Early Buddhist teaching had given great importance to self-efforts in achieving Nibbana. Buddha was regarded as a human being. The idea of Buddha as a savior emerged. It was believed that he is the one who could ensure salvation. Bodhisattvas were perceived a deeply compassionate being that could help others to attain Nibbana. The worship of the image of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas became an important part of this tradition. This new way of thinking was called Mahayana. Literally, the greater vehicle. The followers of Mahayana Buddhism describe the older tradition as Hinayana or the lesser vehicle. Growth of Puranic Hinduism. These include Vaishnavism, a form of Hinduism within which Lord Vishnu was worshipped as the principal deity, and Shaivism, a tradition within which Lord Shiva was regarded as a chief god. Vaishnavism is a form of Hinduism within which Vishnu was worshipped as a principal deity. In the case of Vaishnavism, cults were developed around the various avatars of or incarnation of Lord Vishnu. According to Vaishnavism, there are 10 avatars of Vishnu. Avatars were forms that the deity was believed to have assumed in order to save the world whenever the world was threatened by evil forces. Different avatars were popular in different parts of the country. Shaivism is a tradition within which Shiva was regarded as the chief god. Shiva was symbolized by the linga, although he was occasionally represented in the form of human figure too. Some of these deities were represented in sculptures. All such representation depicted a complex set of ideas about the deities. To understand the meaning of these sculptures, historians have to be familiar with the Puranas. Puranas contain stories about gods and goddesses. They were written in simple Sanskrit and were meant to be read aloud to everybody. Puranas evolved through interaction amongst people, priests, merchants, and ordinary men and women who traveled from place to place sharing ideas and beliefs. For example, Vasudeva Krishna was an important deity in the Mathura region. Over centuries, his worship spread to other parts of the country as well. Growth of temple architecture. When the stupas at sites such as Sachi were taking their present form, at the same time the first temples to house image of gods and goddesses were also being built. The early temples was a small square room called the Garbhagriha with a single doorway for the worshipper to enter and offer worship to the image. Gradually, a tall structure known as Shikhra was built over the central shrine. Temple walls were often decorated with sculpture. Assembly halls, huge walls, gateway and arrangements for supplying water made the latter temples far more elaborate. One of the unique features of early temple was that some of these were hollowed out of huge rocks as artificial caves. An amazing example of the carving out of an entire temple from a cave is that of Kailashnath temples at Ellora. Problems faced by the European scholars while studying the sculpture. Firstly, the European scholars were not familiar with the local tradition and belief. They were horrified by the image of half human and half animals. They considered the Indian sculptures inferior of that of European sculpture from Greece and which they were familiar. This was because they compared the Indian sculpture to the images of Greece with which they were familiar. Secondly, the art historians use textual tradition to understand the meaning of sculpture. While this is a better strategy than comparing the images found in India with that of Greece, but it was not always easy to use. For example, to identify the sculpture along a huge rock in Mahabalipuram, art historians have to search through the Puranas. Thank you.